everybody. Hello, Kerala. It is so exciting to be here, and I think I say this on behalf of Anirudh and Kavitha that it is refreshing to see people coming in for the love of books, for the love of literature, for the love of ideas. So, thank you for turning up in such huge numbers to listen to people who write, read, and speak. This session is mostly on the last bit of that, people who speak. And as podcasters, the three of us are serial yappers. And we talk about the past in ways that make it fascinating and accessible for all of you. But before I go to Kavitha and Anirudh and bring in our podcasts, I want to actually ask a question to each one of you, and you'll show me a raise of hands and answer. How many of you listen to podcasts? Just by a show of hands. Okay. I'll ask it again for people in the back. How many of you listen to podcasts? Any sort of podcast, consume material? All right. How many of you listen to history podcasts? Okay. How many of you did not like history in school? Or did not have a teacher who made history fun in school? Okay. Well, that's a fair less amount of people. Doesn't go with our story. But it is interesting to see that the past is becoming increasingly relevant in our times, and it has become a hot topic that is communicated through different means. And ever since the age of social media, the presence of these aesthetically curated, academically backed posts on places like Instagram and Twitter, and of course through the medium of podcasting and broadcasting, we're able to bring very distant pasts alive and to all of you. And it goes back to the tradition of storytelling and the sutradhar having a responsibility of telling you the story, holding you in, and making sure that your emotions resonate with the stories we are telling. So before we go into the podcast, I would like to open up with both of you, Kavitha and then Anirudh, about why we tell the stories that we do and what are your roles as a storyteller in that aspect.
Storytelling in podcasts or generally? In podcasts. So I've worked at the BBC and I've made TV documentaries, I've written books, but I choose to tell history through podcasts. And I think that's for a number of reasons. The history that I tell, whether it's of the Bengal famine of 1943 or the partition of India or the story of the South Asian diaspora in the post-war years, is first-person testimony. And I think that, firstly, if I was doing it as a TV doc, some of those interviewees wouldn't want to speak to me. But if I was writing a book, you wouldn't hear the interviewee's voice. You wouldn't hear the timbre of it. You wouldn't hear the emotion and the pauses. And I think in the telling of a story, to hear a story in the voice of the person who lived through it or witnessed events is a very unique thing. It just so happens to be the period of history I'm telling. And so I think that's a really important thing of why I choose podcasts. But podcast sits somewhere between a book and television, because the way you write a podcast is a bit like the way you write a book, and that you can conjure images in a person's mind. I'm talking predominantly about narrative podcasts rather than speaking podcasts, which is telling a story. And I love using sound design, music, which we often get composed, to transport the listener into that particular moment in time. It's as if you were there. But I also think that there is a very intimate relationship between the listener and someone who's delivering a podcast. And I think that that is something you can't always replicate, certainly in television. Maybe you can in a book, but let's be honest, a book, and we're amongst friends here, can take ages to write. It can take years to write. Whereas a podcast is, if you're doing it properly, the research should take a pretty long time, but you can make something much more quickly and you can consume it much more quickly. And the final thing I'll say is, there's something extraordinary, which I think all three of us have, which is when you put a podcast out, your audience, the listeners, communicate with you really quickly on social media, or they email you. And through those stories, I often get other stories. Sometimes I'll put additional episodes on my podcast because it unlocks something. And the histories that I do are hidden histories. And you realize these histories aren't hidden at all. It's just that they are not spoken about. And so that, in essence, is why I choose to tell the stories that I do in podcasts.
When I began podcasting back in 2017, I think the Indian podcast scene was very different from how it is now. I think today podcasts are much more easily available on a huge variety of topics. But in 2017, I had somehow got into my head that I wanted to make a podcast. And I searched for Indian history podcasts. And the only one that I could find was hosted by this lovely British gentleman. And it just baffled me that there were no history podcasts by Indians for Indians at that time. And it seemed to me that it was very important for there to be Indian voices telling our histories. And more importantly, I wanted to make a podcast that was evocative, that really transported listeners to ancient India, that made you feel like you were experiencing these sites that seem so distant to us today. On the very interesting point that Kavitha raised about audience feedback, I'd like to share with you a story that one of my listeners told me. Now, the very first episode of my Echoes of India podcast, which is a narrative podcast about ancient India, the very first episode was about Alexander the Great in northern India. And since everybody here loved history classes, do you remember the famous story where King Porus is made to surrender to Alexander, right? And there's this really dramatic sequence of fighting that leads up to it. You know, Porus makes his last stand, etc., etc. And I began to wonder how I could make that narratively evocative. How could I make listeners feel the blood and desperation that must have attended this terrible moment for the king? And what we decided on was to create a soundscape of the battlefield. So we had elephants trumpeting, and when the king and his bodyguards make the last stand, we decided to put in the sound of conch shells blowing, because we know that ancient Indians used it on battlefields. And a listener told me that they were cutting vegetables when they put on the first episode of Echoes, and they almost cut off their finger because they'd never heard conch shells in a podcast before. So I think in various ways, we're all trying to achieve the same thing with podcasting, in that we understand that it's a more flexible kind of format as far as bringing new ideas to the audience. It doesn't take as much time to put out as a book, but at the same time, it can be as sensorily evocative as words can. In some ways, perhaps even more evocative.
No, that's completely true. I think the idea of creating an immersive soundscape to create those moments that are so away from us and yet feel so close to us, because as storytellers, we are able to do that. You talked about how listening to the voice of somebody who can tell a story that they either have felt themselves or that their families have gone through, it changes the way in which you perceive it. Similarly, Anirudh, for you too, you're saying that creating that immersive moment in a podcast with designing, with the music, with taking them back to a certain time is what makes it so interesting. That was part of the reason why even my work began, wherein we would take people to museums and monuments. And the first question, or one of the questions that they would always ask at a monument is there a ghost story here? Because a lot of monuments are haunted across. And, Anirudh was just telling me that across different geographies, there are different kinds of ghosts. So in South India, you have very different ghosts than you would have in North India and Delhi. Now in Delhi, there's a very interesting place called the Mutiny Memorial, which is an 1857 monument. And it records mostly the mutiny that took place in 1857, the first war of independence as it's dubbed in the northern education system. Now, they say that if you go to this memorial at night, there's a ghost over there, and it's a British ghost, and he wears khaki pants and khaki outfits. And he will come to you in the middle of the night and he'll ask you for a light, because he wants to light up a cigarette. But then they also say that this ghost is headless. He has no head, much like the headless ghost going around Delhi. And you begin to wonder, if he is headless, how is he going to smoke? But the interesting thing is that the ghost of the British officer over there is a remnant of a larger time. It's the remnant of a period colonial. And that is what I want to come to now, because the kind of stories that fascinate people may have these hooks, like a ghost story or medieval gossip in your case, we'll come to in a bit. But there are also a lot of stories that lead us to larger pictures, or why do they exist in popular imagination. Now, wherein you have so many British ghosts in Delhi and ghosts from Empire, you were telling me earlier that in Britain there is this silence about the empire, about colonialism, which also then led you to doing work in educating people about that moment in time, but also using podcasts as a medium to remind them of an event that we barely listen to or know about, the Bengal famine of 1943. So let's go into 3 million and the responsibility of a podcaster in bringing these stories.
Well, the story of 3 million is the story of the Bengal famine in 1943. And it kind of blew my mind that this enormous event happened in the middle of the Second World War, because of the Second World War, and 3 million humans perished. They were Indian subjects, they were British subjects, they were Indian people. Now, in Britain, when we read about the story of the war, we absolutely do not read about the story of the Bengal famine. And it's further complicated by the fact that Winston Churchill, our wartime leader, who is regarded by so many as a hero, is arguably implicated in some form or other in the Bengal famine. And so I wanted to look into this history, but I was very aware that this is a hugely contentious history in Britain, because you're touching something that is at the core of Britain's national story. So I had to approach it with enormous care and due diligence. I knew that my work would be under enormous amounts of scrutiny, especially because it was on the BBC. And so when I wrote my script, I actually wrote it as if I was writing a book. I footnoted everything, because I knew if there were any issues, I could say, well, actually, I went to that primary source and that's where I got this bit of information from. So I think that with history, and certainly contentious history, there is a huge responsibility on the podcaster to do their work thoroughly and properly. Because in Britain, there's a culture war where history is at the forefront. In India, there are questions about which history we should remember and which history we should forget. And it's our job as historians or writers of history, public historians, to handle this history with great care, because we do not want to be part of misinformation. Now, that does absolutely not mean that we have to write a boring essay, because no one's going to listen to that. But I think we have to do the research really, really carefully. And then once you've gathered the research, you've gathered your key characters, you then can do what we do, which is sit, storyboard, and try and tell the most exciting and gripping story that we can, but you tell it with all the nuance. And with a story like the Bengal famine, there's huge amounts of nuance and complication. But you can do that with radio. That's possible, and that's one of the great things. You can tell it with these great characters that I've interviewed or gone into the archive to hear, but at its core, you feel confident that the history that you're telling has been done with due diligence and that you can defend it. Because I think that when particular narratives are told about so-called national histories and what collective histories we should or should not be doing, we're trying to open people's minds here and say, well, these are histories that you should perhaps know, or these are perspectives you should know. Or if someone is telling you what you can and you can't read, well, maybe question that. And so I think there is a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. Now, that's not necessarily the case when you're hearing it, but I would hope that a lot of work has gone into the production of those kinds of history programs.
I think you've touched on something very interesting, Kavitha, which is why do we listen to podcasts? Why? And the thing is that I think unless one is very familiar with the subject, you can't automatically tell when a podcast is deeply researched versus when it's not. But I think what both misinformation and good quality information have in common is that they're great stories. They make people feel something. That's why we listen. That's why we consume media, because they make us feel things. And that's also to an extent what guided my process of making Echoes of India, because I think that when we think about history in India today, we think of history as a procession of kings and queens, right? To us, and it's partially a result of the education system, but more broadly a result of the kind of primary sources we have, in that Indian royals tended to write on imperishable materials, and so it is their view of the past, their view of themselves at the center of history and everybody else being a little bit of a side act, that I think still shapes our national idea of how history works. And as I was researching Echoes, and it was when I was doing an episode on the Amaravati Stupa. So Amaravati is this great Buddhist site in coastal Andhra Pradesh, which at one point was home to the largest stupa anywhere in the world. And as I was reading the inscriptions of Amaravati, what really struck me is that the stupa was not a royal construction. It was not ordered by a king or a queen. It was crowdsourced, essentially. You had a number of small donors who would donate a railing this year, a cup of ghee that year. And through the agglomeration of thousands of donations like this enormous structure was able to be built. And the inscriptions that record these gifts are so brief, but they offer such an interesting glimpse, such a tantalizing glimpse of the lives of the people who paid for this enormous structure. It'll be something like, oh, this is the gift of such and such, the wife of such and such, the barber, or something like that. And what I decided to do to kind of nudge against this idea of royals as the makers of history is I got my colleagues at my workplace to record these lines and then put them into the podcast. And that's actually what gave me the idea to call it Echoes of India in the first place, in that I wanted it to feel like you're hearing the whispers of people who are alive, people who weren't just royals, but people like you and me, everyday people. And more broadly, I think that it is not just a question of which sections of society are the protagonists of history, but more broadly, which regions. And of course, those of you, I see some familiar faces, folks who are here in the morning for the session I did with Ashwata, Nikhil, and Rushikesh here. We talked about how our understanding of Indian history is really an understanding of North Indian history. It's a narrative in which South India, East India play very little role. And simply hearing these stories in a well-told, easily digestible format that touches upon people like you and me, I think is a very important way of broadening our understanding of the past. It is a way of returning to the center stage, the voices that should have been heard but have not been. But with the potential of the audio medium, you can quite literally hear them again.
Can I just add to that, the point that you make about feeling something? Because when I recorded my testimonies, you heard stories of people who were observers to the famine, and they were just little children and they felt helpless. Or people who had to make horrific decisions about which child they were going to feed. And I knew that for Britain to connect to this story, they had to feel something, because everybody knows or can imagine what it must be like not to be able to feed a child. You think, what would I do if that were me? But also everybody understands war, or what they thought was war. And you realize, oh my God, they went through war too, and look how they suffered. And so I think that if you can connect and feel something about a piece of history, then you will ask more questions and you will say, what was this famine? And then why did this happen? But the other thing you can do is tell different stories, and tell different stories by the people who are telling those stories. And My history is kind of bottom-up history. I'm not that interested in the kind of high politics, the people who made decisions. I'm interested about what massive events feel like for the ordinary person. And I think you can do that extremely effectively through the power of podcasting.
There are two very interesting things that I picked up from both of you in this case, then, that when you talk about making people feel something for those impacted by those very processions or high politics that we read about, that then opens the scope to even being an empath towards these characters from the past that we think are so away from us. You know, Anirudh, I remember, much like, for example, Akbar, when he was 13, he was crowned emperor. His father died. And we read about it in a nonchalant way where there is no emotion attached to the fact that a young 13-year-old, a teenager, is becoming the king of an empire like that of the Mughals. You've also talked about a South Indian king, right?
Yes,
What's the name?
yes. Amogha Varsha Rashtrakuta.
How old was he?
He would have been, I think, 14. So
14 years, so 13, 14. So, you know, that was the color of the times. You would have a father dying at a very early age, and you would have to take the throne at an early age. But the fact still remains that these were people. They had a teen life. They had a childhood, and they had as many emotions as we do. So as public historians, there's a responsibility to bring those emotions to life and to tell you that story. But I want to nudge a little bit now, because both of you mentioned feedback and the easiness with which we can bring the public into the realm. But we are also speaking in an age when public history is becoming a hot topic. We're also living in an age of misinformation and misconception. So when you have these very popular podcasts, you know, with 5 million subscribers and 30 million downloads, and you're going through Instagram Reels, and you come across this, you know, gaudily edited video where there's a historian sitting and saying, I will tell you the truth about history because you have been lied to for the past 300 years, and this is what they have been saying. You are combating that. You are fighting with a school of delusion and misconception. So how do we, as public historians, then make sure that we remain academic and nuanced and also battle this? Anirudh, let's start with you and then I'll come to Kavitha.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot straight off the bat, Eric. I do think that I don't know if delusion is the word that I would use for what's happening with the consumption of misinformation. I think that there is a genuine curiosity in all of us to learn about the people who came before. And I think it's partially a result of the education system, but more broadly of the information ecosystem, in that we're never really encouraged to think about the past. We're never really encouraged to think about how histories are written. We are told that Ashoka planted mango trees next to the highway because he was a great king. But we're never really invited to interrogate why we think this is the case. Why is it so important for us that Ashoka did such and such thing? What really was the nature of political power? How do we know that his motivation was simply a high-minded need to take care of his subjects versus a more straightforward political calculation as to what would bring him the most popularity? Now, it's impossible to answer these questions, but it's still important to ask them. We need to understand that the telling of history is not something that's set in stone. It's something that's always contested. It's something that we will never really get to the absolute bottom of. And very often the histories we tell say a lot more about who we are than who the people of the past were. Now, as a public historian, the way I try to push back against this is of course, simply by allowing different kinds of voices to rise to the fore through my podcast. But I think the most important aspect of it for me is through books. I think that it's very important in an age where information and dopamines are available at the swipe of a finger, for us to really engage with and grapple with information arguments once again. So in both of my books, Lords of the Deccan and of course my new history of the Chola Empire, Lords of Earth and Sea, I made sure to obsessively footnote, just like Kavitha did with her podcast, practically every sentence, because it's important for all of us to be historically literate. Whether you're interested in history or not, I think it's important for us to understand why do we come to particular conclusions about the past. How do you read a primary source? What can these sources tell us and not tell us? And most importantly, remember that the people of history are not these unquestionable heroes or irredeemable villains. These are complex people who are doing the best that they can, just like you and me. And this idea, I think, can come across through empathetic storytelling, whether it's in long form writing or through audio production.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. History is always changing, and I'm completely obsessed with what we collectively and personally choose to remember and what we choose to forget. And, you know, in Britain, I went through an entire education system, and I never once, honestly, even heard the word empire. I was definitely not taught about the empire. I had to do the work myself. I mean, you could argue the last 10 years has just been like therapy for me to try to get to the bottom of it. But it's like this secret that's absolutely not a secret because, you know, my dad went through partition, lost everything. Why wouldn't he come to Britain? He came to Britain, which was the former colonial ruler, because in 1948 it passed the Nationality Act, which meant that everyone who came after 1948 until 62 could become automatic citizens. That is a story of empire. And if you don't understand empire, you don't understand why I live in Britain. And that story was never told to me, was never told to British people about why there are millions of South Asians in their country. And you wouldn't believe me when I tell you that there are young people I speak to today that don't even know that the British were in India. There's a lot of work that has to be done. And I'm not by any means saying that, you know, podcasting is the answer. And things are changing. Things are changing, actually, because also the children, grandchildren of empire are really interested in their history, and they're asking these questions about themselves, their place in Britain, but also about Britain and India. And so things are changing. It's still not part of the national curriculum in England to learn about empire. And podcasting is certainly one way. You know, my friends William Dalrymple and Anita Anand have a brilliant podcast about empire, which is hugely successful. But of course, there are books, there are TV docs, but it's just that we're living in a time where, you know, it's still painful to talk about these things because it's still just about within living memory. And maybe in the next generation, the generation afterwards, they won't be so hung up about learning about that. But, you know, history is being weaponized in lots of countries around the world at the moment. History is contested. All of us who dip our toe into the sphere of history, you know, you talk about social media, it's pretty ugly out there. You know, you get some pretty horrible comments. You know, when I did the Bengal famine, it was like too much Churchill, not enough Churchill, depending on your point of view. And you have to be slightly robust, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but you should make sure that the history you're putting out there, you can stand by. But actually, you know what? There are facts, some of which mostly you can't dispute. But even, for example, the number 3 million, which is the name of my podcast, that is disputed. Was it 3 million people? And so, you know, our job as historians is always to question that, to probe that, but also to understand, as it should be, that every generation rewrites history and looks at history in a different way and asks different questions and wants to hear different voices, different perspectives. And even if we're being encouraged not to do that, we should do that both as program makers, but also as listeners.
So, It's interesting because you began this by saying that there is a politics to what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget, and what we choose to tell. And you talked about the curiosity that we have innate. All of us want to hear things, especially when they're not told to us. But you can see very tangible reminders all around you that this doesn't make sense. And I haven't read this in my books. Why is there a park after Victoria in my city? And so you go back to trace a larger history. But then there is also how the story is told, which changes from geography to geography. For example, if you do not have conversations on empire in Britain, and even if you do, the kind of conversation that you would have there is going to be much different than the kind of conversation you have in India about empire. Similarly, with 3 million, the passage about the Bengal famine, at least in our books in North India and NCRT, was just one small paragraph that, World War II happened and then the Bengal famine also was taking place at the same time, and then there are 2 paragraphs of Winston Churchill, and then you move on. We face a lot of problem consistently with an overwhelming amount of information of North Indian kings and North Indian politics in books all across India. And there is then also the problem of accessibility of books. There is a public library problem in India. And all of you who are here at the festival, we have the free library movement also. I think they have a stall here. Mridula Koshi is the person to talk to. And I was talking to her yesterday, and I'm thinking about it now, that when you do not have communities around reading, and when you have so many first generation readers in India, podcasting then is an accessible way because you're telling them the story that they will not be able to access through books. Do you both agree with that?
I think you're completely right, Eric. And I think that so much of the angst that we see and so much of the contention that we see in the Indian public history space is because there is to an extent, genuinely felt anger that something about the past has been kept from us. And this also dovetails with anxieties about development, about inequality, that very often are quite elegantly diverted towards history. So history has become this space of tremendous and sometimes very angry contention. Now, I think that, yes, a really big way to address this is through better quality reading materials, through better quality podcasts. But I think it's also, it would be incorrect to not also point to the way that the information ecosystem works. In that, if a young Indian wants to talk about history today, and I mean, I'm aware of the irony of saying that folks are asking me as a fairly young chap myself for my advice on how to get into the history space. But it always breaks my heart when I have to tell young folks that, look, if you want to get into history writing, history talking in India, you have to be prepared to troll, to be trolled.
To be trolled.
To be trolled.
Yeah.
And how tragic is that young folks who very often are coming to this from a space of curiosity, from a genuine from a space of genuine goodwill, in that they want to bring their stories to the fore once again. How tragic that they have to put up with this vile, endless torrent of anger and abuse in order to be able to do this job. And why do they have to put up with this? Because social media algorithms are being designed by engineers sitting in California, whose incentive is to make sure that engagement numbers are higher and higher for American stockholders. Do you see how ironic the situation is, that we have so completely lost control over our public spaces, over our intellectual spaces, that whether or not a young historian is able to do their job in India is entirely dependent on how the censoring algorithm decided by a Silicon Valley tech magnate needs to look. And I have to be honest, I don't really know how we solve that problem. I think that a big part of it, of course, is to improve the quality of discourse in India. But there is also this broader, globally iniquitous system that favors particular kinds of voices, particular kinds of outcomes. It seems that the tendency is to favor profiteering in the West rather than stable communities and conversations in the global South.
Which is why I think what is so interesting about history is it's not history. It's never history. It's about us. It's about today. And it's what is it that's so painful to touch about these subjects that can trigger this trolling that makes people so angry. And you can't just blame the tech companies. These are genuine sentiments that people feel. They feel like you're attacking the very country itself by daring to raise different bits of history or different voices. And I think it's, with great trepidation are public historians prepared to put their head above the parapet. And it's pretty frightening, actually.
It is.
I would say. One other thing I wanted to say about podcasting, which I think is pretty wonderful to go back to on a more positive note, to go back to your kind of public libraries thought, is that we're talking about podcasts, obviously English-speaking podcasts, but when you make a podcast, you know that you could be listened to pretty much anywhere in the world, and that's a good thing about tech. And so someone in Guatemala might be learning about South India, or, I got so many responses from 3 million or from Partition Voices, from people around the world listening. And that is really wonderful because you can hear anywhere in the world, but also it's free.
But also you can be trolled by anyone in the world. The flip side of it is that you can... So I do agree with qualifications, but it's important to understand that I think the production of emotions, the production of narratives of what is ours and what can be and what can't be questioned does also depend on the information ecosystem to an extent.
It's also about what you want to hear, because the kind of trolling that you may be facing being in Britain, telling the story of the famine, I'm sure that's very different. I mean, trolling remains the same at its core, but the kind of trolls that would be coming your way, because how dare you tell a story that was such a tumultuous and, disastrous period for us, but it has the British colonial policy and role in it. So I'm sure that brings its own set of troubles for you.
It was from both sides. It was kind of, as I say, too much Churchill, not enough Churchill. And who the hell are you to tell? Not really from the Indian side, but it's like, it always gets, in Britain, it gets a bit racist. Because it's going to the heart of it. Who tells the story about our country?
A few weeks ago, there was an entire debate that was sparked up. You mentioned William, and Anirudh and I both commentated on it in different pieces, which was an entire question of the role of the public historian and the role of the academic. And I think it was such a refreshing thing to see for that period. The conversation so alive and so many voices coming from across spheres, public historians, academics. And what we were thinking is that even when Anirudh talks about footnoting his book, every little sentence, I panicking if my bibliography is not more than 300 pages long. And Kavitha, you too, talking about storyboarding your podcast, but also making sure that everything you say comes with that responsibility. I do not think that this debate is about academia versus the public historian. It is about how public historians are using academia as the spine, as the core, and bringing in people's stories so that they are more relatable and more resonant with a larger audience. Isn't that what it is about?
Yeah, I think that in many ways it's a bit of a false dichotomy. I think that if you want to have a thriving public history sphere, you need to have a thriving academia. And by the same logic, if you want academia to thrive and get the funding and attention it deserves, you need to have public historians who can bring them the attention, bring their work the attention that it richly deserves. But what I'd be quite interested in understanding is how different the Indian public history ecosystem is compared to the UK public history ecosystem. Because it seems to me, sitting here in India, that the UK does have a stronger bridge between academia and the public sphere. It seems that a lot more UK academics are comfortable with engaging with and harnessing media to an extent that isn't the same in India.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I think academics have podcasts, they will be TV historians. I think they've realized that if they want to have a bigger audience for their work, they have to be able to creatively tell the stories of the great characters in their books, or the kind of complicated arguments that other people were having in history that we're probably still having today. So it is quite a kind of natural crossover. I would say in both directions, actually.
What are
In
your
both
thoughts on
directions,
this,
as in
Eric?
India too.
So I don't know about India.
Okay, in both
But
directions, as
Britain.
in with
No, in Britain,
reception
between
and presentation.
academia and public.
Yeah, because an
history.
example that comes to my mind, Anirudh, is Mary Beard,
Yeah, exactly.
who is a classicist,
Exactly.
she's a scholar,
Exactly.
and she's been a TV presenter for the last 30
And
years.
a hugely successful television presenter. She will be stopped in the street. So, yeah, that's a great example. And it's not an anomalous example by any means.
So perhaps I think there is that gap over here because it is resource, Anirudh, as you said. It is about funding too, because we can say that you have to make the past more fascinating in your schools and in your college textbooks. But how are our academics getting funded? There is practically no encouragement of those niches. For example, curation in London, to be a curator at V&A or the British Museum, and to have that entire ecosystem. That is an entire economy and a job that exists, which is practically non-existent for us over here. You do not even see it as a career option. Art history, India being literally layers of art histories across centuries, and yet art history is offered in very little colleges and universities, you know. So I do think it's about resources. It is about books, but I think in our own ways, we are trying to make sure that the stories that we know, we bring them to the world. And I think that's one step ahead. I think we have to open to the audience.
Q&A?
We just have 10 minutes left, so I think we'll open to the audience now. If there are any questions, you can raise your hand and we will be happy to take them now. Any questions? Oh, we've completely left them spellbound with our discussion on the past. So I think we can then take on one more question. I think, Anirudh, you wanted to add something.
Well, I'm wondering if we can just take a little bit of a turn away from podcasting and these dense and contentious topics and perhaps spend the last 10 minutes talking about ghost stories.
Ghost stories. I don't think that's going to
No?
be an. Or actually, could talk about the kind of creative processes that led us to telling the stories that we tell, because it's not only about making a script and sitting in front of the mic. There's a larger process that goes into being. So as I said, that when I talk about ghosts in my podcast, it's not that I went to a monument and they said, well, there's a ghost here, and I said, let me sit with the mic. It was a larger idea that the ghost that exists at a particular monument is an offshoot of a larger political moment in time, a historical moment in time. And therefore, sitting with that story, bringing that oral history back home, and thinking why why the ghost of Dara Shuko haunts a particular road in Delhi, or why a British man, a colonial officer, haunts the Mutiny Memorial in Delhi. It became interesting to see the larger political and historical questions this was leading to. And thus the scripting began. So my creative process has always been about sitting with oral histories. I think we also create these distinctions and dichotomies between folklore, oral histories, myth, academic pasts. But as you said, Kavitha, it is not just about history, it's about us and the stories we tell. So that is what my creative process has been like. And I would love to know from both of you, what is the creative process in scripting the story?
Kavitha?
So I have a team. I often have producers and an editor. And you start with a tiny kernel of an idea. And my idea for 3 million, but actually began, and I hadn't even realized what was happening. I did an interview with someone for Partition. And I always start by asking people very generic questions like, you know, what was your childhood like? And, you know, all of that. And she said, oh, my childhood in Calcutta was a British woman. She was saying, oh, my childhood in Calcutta was really wonderful. Oh, but then there was this time where there were dead bodies everywhere. And I remember vultures picking at them. And I was like, oh, my God. And what is she talking about? And then after the interview, I went back. And I remember thinking, what the hell is this thing that happened that she was talking about? I knew nothing about. And then the Partition program went out, and someone in my office said, oh, I've got this Bengali lady who saw the Bengal families 80 years. What shall I do with it? And I thought, could I do a series that told the story through first-person testimonies? It's 80 years on. That's quite hard. So that's how I started. And then I kind of asked around and I found I could get testimony. So my first thing that I do is I gather my material, which is a number of things. I gather the people who are survivors. I gather the eyewitnesses, who are two different things. But 80 years on, it's quite a long time. When I did Partition, it was 70 years. There were more people around that I could interview. So I went into the archives to find audio interviews that had been done, but nobody had ever used and nobody had ever broadcast. So I gathered those. I spoke to experts. I went in search, or my team went in search of archive material from the time. And so you begin to have your ingredients. And then what we do is we all sit around the team. We have our key characters. We've done our work pretty diligently, and we worked with, on that, 3 historical consultants. But we then storyboarded, which basically means you divide your episodes a bit like a Netflix TV drama, and you work out how you tell this story in the most engaging way across 7 episodes, say, where your highs are, where your lows are, what key moments you're hitting. Is it going to be chronological or is it not going to be chronological? And so that process can take days. And once you kind of have a structure, then I will start writing. But even when you're writing, once you listen to the material and once you're putting it together, you're still shifting things around. So it's very fluid. It's literally fluid until, probably a couple of days before transmission. But everything is thought out very carefully. And so once you've written the scripts, and once the editor has gone through it, and once all the kind of editorial things have been everyone's happy, you then record, and then you do the exciting thing where it totally comes to life. And you put the sound design in. So you're in Calcutta in 1943, and you've got the sounds of the city. And then you put your music. And you have to be quite careful with the music because you don't want to overdo the emotion, but it's always quite evocative. And I think that the music for me is always the kind of icing on the cake. And then you listen through thousands of times and you improve and you make better. But to make something from the raw ingredients into something that is just kind of really phenomenal listening takes months, if not maybe a year or more. And a lot of people are involved in that process, I would say.
That's fascinating. And I think my process is quite different in that it tended to be a lot more of a solitary effort. I found generally when I was researching episodes or researching a season at a time, I would have like a vague sense chronologically of how I wanted to tell it. But constantly, as I was reading the sources, I would ask myself, how would somebody in the time have received this? And there's 2 episodes I'd like to share with you guys in particular. The first was when I was researching the Kushan Empire. And so this is roughly around the 1st, 2nd century CE. And it was a time when a lot of great stupas were being constructed in northwest India. And we know that cities were also developing around them. So Gandhara, Takshashila, if you guys have heard of them, these were cities that really became massive at this time. And to me, the story was, because I was living in Bangalore at the time, I was just wondering how they dealt with traffic. Because obviously ancient cities, as they grew faster than what their road systems could provide for, must have had traffic jams. You must have had bullock cart drivers who had a cart that was too wide for a particular street and ended up causing a whole ruckus. But that turned into an interesting potential soundscape that we could create of guys yelling at each other in the streets while cattle are moving. The other, and like the episode that to me was the most enjoyable to do, was set in ancient Ujjain. So Ujjain is a city in Madhya Pradesh. And it was part of the Gupta Empire. So the Gupta Empire, of course, being this Gangetic polity that all of us have heard of, but was also quite extended quite deep into central India as well. Now, we know that in the 5th century, when the Gupta Empire was fighting the Huns, who were the Central Asian nomadic people who were entering North India at the time, we know that they fought with each other, but I got to wondering, how did the average person living far away from the frontier, perceive all these conflicts and these battles. And as I was thinking about this, I happened to just randomly stumble upon this extraordinary Sanskrit drama called the Pada Taditaka by Shyamilaka. And I'm very impressed I managed to get those both right without messing up the syllables. But this is a story that was written in the courtesans district of Ujjain. So it's written by this man who's walking around. He's a gambler. He's just walking around the city and like just chit chatting to people. And while the war is happening, and there's like a brief mention that that the emperor is away fighting this war, his main focus is that, did you hear that a courtesan kicked the head of her paramour who's a judge? And now the judge has demanded that he receive justice, and all the heads of the brothels are gathering to decide what needs to be done about this extremely serious offense. And it just reiterated to me that the things that we take so seriously about the past may not have been seen exactly the same way the people who are actually living through these events. And as I think all of us have been saying in various ways to this conversation, history isn't just the story of the people who are writing the records that are sitting in the archives. It's really the story of people who've lived through them. And to imagine, to try and reconstruct these lives through all these myriad different sources, I think has really changed the way not just that I see the past, but also the way that I see the present. Because the faces around us in the audience today are the faces of people who lived thousands and thousands of years ago, and the faces of people who will continue to live after us.
That's fascinating, Anirudh, and thank you, Kavitha, for the process. And I think it's so right to leave it on this point that we sometimes perhaps sanctify the past a lot. We revere it in a way which makes it on a pedestal, and we forget these were people like us. You go to monuments and museums and you see there are sculptures, but there are sculptures of people smiling, there are sculptures of people battling with each other, there are couples quarreling with one another, and so gossip, quarreling, all sorts of desires, happiness, sadness, that has been a part of the long historical story. And those are the kind of stories that we wish to tell through our podcast. Thank you. This has been fabulous. And thank you to all of you too for being a part of this session.
Thank you all, and thank you, Eric.
Do note that both Anirudh and Kavitha will be signing books wherever the book, you could tell them about that. And yes, thank you once again.